Welcome to the LuckyShots podcast with your host, Ricky Larson, presented by LuckyShots Media.
What's up, everyone? It's your host, Ricky Larson, and this is the LuckyShots podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Last time on the show, we took a deep dive into the running back position, and today we are tackling wide receivers, where they rank, where you should draft them, the outlook for their season, and how that can affect your fantasy numbers. Without further ado, let's hop right in. Alright, so these first few names aren't going to shock you really, but how should they be ranked in the grand scheme of things? We start off the 2021 wide receiver rankings with Tyreek Hill. The Kansas City Chief comes in ranked number 1 on my charts as he finished second place last season overall. He scored second in overall points with 328.9 scored and second in average with 21.9. He raked in 87 receptions for 1,200 yards and 15 touchdowns. He added 2 of those on the ground as well. The Chiefs are one of the best teams in the league, and they love to throw the ball, especially deep to Tyreek Hill, where he finished number 2 in deep targets. He is a big play wide receiver who can explode for fantasy weeks, making him a necessity for your squad this season. Coming in at number 2 is number 17, Davante Adams. The Packer finished as number 1 receiver last year with 341.8 total points and 25.6 points per game. He had 115 receptions for 1,300 yards and 18 touchdowns. What makes this even more incredible is that he put up these stats while missing 2 games. He is an obvious focal point for the offense, but the concern of whether or not Aaron Rodgers will be at the helm, throwing him the football could cause hesitancy. I still see Adams as the biggest part of that offense, however, regardless of who is throwing him the football. He was number 1 in red zone targets last season, which gives you a large advantage with the touchdowns that he can be accountable for, so pick him up as soon as possible. Third on the list is the Arizona Cardinal, DeAndre Hopkins. D-Hop finished 4th overall last season in points with 280.3 and 5th in average points with 17.9. Hopkins hauled in 115 receptions for 1,400 yards and 6 touchdowns in his first season as a Cardinal. The offense really started to take off in the latter part of the season as D-Hop and Kyler really started to gel well. Hopkins ranked very highly last season as well, as he was ranked 2nd in targets, 2nd in target share, 2nd in receptions, 2nd in receiving yards, and 2nd in yards after the catch. It is safe to say he fits very well in Arizona, and he will fit very well in your fantasy lineup. The wide receiver 4 position belongs to Stephon Diggs, who also made his debut last season with a new team, the Buffalo Bills. He seemed to be exactly what Josh Allen and the Bills needed, as he and the team made a playoff run last year. Diggs finished 3rd in total points scored with 314 points, and 3rd in points per game with 20.5. As a player, Diggs led the league in receptions with 127 and in yards with over 1,500. He was also the top targeted wide receiver last season and was in the top 5 for air yards. Josh Allen loves this guy, and so should you, because he can boost your fantasy team to some dream numbers. Rounding out the top 5 is the Los Angeles Chargers' Keenan Allen. Allen was a top 10 wide receiver last year, ranking 9th in total points with 245 and 7th in points per game with 17.5. Allen did have to work through some injuries, missing 2 full games and subbing out in a few others, but was still able to put up numbers. He racked up 100 receptions for just shy of 1,000 yards and added 8 touchdowns. Keenan was 5th in the league in overall targets and target share, and was in the top 10 for red zone targets. When he was on the field with Justin Herbert, it wasn't hard to know who was going to get the ball. He was crafty in how he got open, and Herbert called his number very often. If Allen stays healthy, he can easily be a top 5 wide receiver for this fantasy season, so make sure to pick him up early.
Brand new banger.
Continuing on with some top-tier wide receivers, we move on to DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. In his sophomore season, Metcalf took a giant leap forward as he finished in the top 10 for total points scored with 266 and points per game with 16.9. DK had 83 receptions on 129 targets and 1,300 yards with 10 touchdowns. Thanks to the let Russ cook stint this past season, Metcalf was 2nd in air yards and 3rd in deep targets. He proved he would be a valuable asset to the offense and a large target for Wilson to look for throughout the game. Metcalf should be a hot commodity going into the 2021 fantasy draft. A staple at the wide receiver position for fantasy football in recent years, Adam Thielen finds himself back inside the top 10 this coming season. Thielen finished last year as the number 10 wide receiver in total points with 244, and just outside of the top 10 in points per game with 16.9. He hauled in 74 passes for 925 yards and 14 touchdowns. With the sensation of Justin Jefferson last year, Thielen had to fight for his share in the offense, but Minnesota made it very clear in a lot of games that he was the top target, force-feeding him at times and padding your fantasy numbers if you had him. The 14 touchdowns he caught was good for 3rd in the league, as he was the 3rd most targeted player in the red zone. Pair that with a top 5 finish in fantasy points per target, and Adam Thielen is still a deadly player to stash on your roster. Despite all of the quarterback drama his team faced last season and the drama that they most likely will receive this season, Allen Robinson comes in number 8 on my fantasy big board. Robinson finished last season as the number 7 wide receiver in total points with 257, but outside the top 10 in points per game with 16.4. It was a productive year as he snagged 102 passes for 1,250 yards, but he only had 6 touchdowns. He will have the same problems this year, I believe, as Andy Dalton is the starter, but the Bears drafted Justin Fields with their first draft pick. Regardless of all the other quarterback mess that is Chicago Bears, Robinson is still a talented player and should find himself as a top option as a fantasy wide receiver. Rookie wide receivers came in last season to the league to impress, and this next wide receiver drew comparisons to the great Randy Moss. He is the highest ranked sophomore wide receiver this season, as well as all the other players don't even rank inside the top 25. Justin Jefferson burst onto the scene last season for the Minnesota Vikings. As a rookie, he put up monster numbers. He had 88 receptions for 1,400 yards and 7 touchdowns. And he ranked inside the top 10 for both average points per game and total points per game last year. For reference, the only rookie wide receiver that was close to him was CeeDee Lamb, who was 20th in overall points and 33rd in points per game. This season can only build to a huge rookie year, as he and Adam Thielen are one of the deadliest wide receiver tandems in the league. Jefferson is a guy you may just have to jump on quickly in this fantasy draft. Rounding out the top 10 is a player who I believe is very underrated, and with the exit of Julio Jones from town, I think he's going to become an elite wide receiver this year. The Falcons' Calvin Ridley had a great year last season, as he was in the top 5 in both total points and points per game. He held in 90 receptions for nearly 1,400 yards and 10 touchdowns. All that production and not nearly enough credit in my opinion. There will also be a distraction on the field as the Falcons drafted Kyle Pitts, another freak athlete, which will put the attention on him from the defense and allow Ridley to continue to produce. I think Calvin Ridley could be a top 10 wide receiver by the end of the season, so he is definitely someone you should want in your lineup from week to week.
Brand new banger.
At number 11 is A.J. Brown, but he could easily overachieve this rank. Brown was outside of the top 15 in total points, missing 2 full games and having troubles with some other injuries, as he only scored 216 points total. However, he was number 6 in points per game last year with 17.6, and he had 3 games over 25 points. Brown will now have to contend for targets a little more than normal, with the Titans' addition of Julio Jones this offseason. Brown had 106 targets last year, turning that into 70 receptions for just over 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns. Even though he has competition on the team now, and he is ranked towards the bottom of the top 10, A.J. Brown is still a star talent and could easily be a top 5 wide receiver by the end of the year. After a Super Bowl finish last season, Mike Evans and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers look to shine again this season. Evans finished 11th in total points with 241 and 16th in points per game at 15.5. He had a shaky start to the year, but posted elite numbers with 70 receptions for 1,000 yards and 13 touchdowns. He was the number 4 target inside the red zone, and total touchdowns is 4th is where he ranked, which means a lot of points for your fantasy team. Tampa will have most of the key parts of their offense from last year, this year, having Gronk, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Tom Brady, so we should see a lot more of the same out of Mike Evans this year. He could be a top option for your fantasy squad, so jump on him early. Coming in at number 13, Tyler Lockett looks to boost his ranking from last season with the Seahawks. 13th is where he finished last year, and that's where he is this year, as he racked up 100 receptions for over 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns for 232.4 fantasy points. He averaged 16.5 to finish 12th in that category. Like DK, who we talked about earlier, Lockett benefited from the aired-out passing game Seattle went to early in the year. He was in the top 5 for routes run and receptions, and in the top 10 for total touchdowns and catch rate. Pair all of that with a top 5 quarterback and a top 10 partner at wideout, Lockett should help the Seahawks fly this season. One of the most consistent breakout wide receivers in the league is the Los Angeles Rams' Robert Woods. Wood has been a face on fantasy rosters for the past few years, and last year he finished in the top 15 for points scored with 237. He snagged 90 passes for 936 yards and 8 total touchdowns. The Rams also have a new quarterback at the helm, the gunslinging Matt Stafford. I personally love Stafford for the Rams and their wide receivers, and I think Robert Woods, along with Cooper Kupp, will benefit greatly. The deep target and air yard numbers aren't always high for Woods or anyone on the Rams offense, but with the addition of Matt Stafford, I think Woods has another huge fantasy year. This next player is poised to have a scary season, as he has a new quarterback in town. Scary Terry McLaurin for the Washington football team is a player who hasn't quite cemented himself as a top fantasy wide receiver. However, he has showed a lot of promise and upside, and with the addition of Ryan Fitzpatrick to the team, McLaurin should see a healthy uptick in production. Terry had 87 receptions for 1,100 yards last season, but only had 4 touchdowns. If the touchdowns can catch up to the rest of his stat line, he can be a scary player to see on an opposing team this fantasy season.
Brand new banger.
This season could be a much better year for the Dallas Cowboys with the return of Dak Prescott. One person that will definitely be happy that he is back is Amari Cooper. In the first 4 full games that Prescott played, Amari racked up 37 receptions for 401 yards and a touchdown. After Dak went down, Cooper's numbers declined a bit. He finished the year 14th overall with 92 receptions for 1,100 yards and 5 touchdowns. You can only think of what kind of year it would have been if Dak was healthy, and Cooper got to put up the numbers he did in those first 4 weeks for the whole season. He is only outside of the top 15 because we have yet to see the full experience of Dak and Amari. The Bengals have done a great job of rebuilding their offense in the past few years, and one receiver who stands out is Tyler Boyd. Boyd played 15 of the 16 games last year as he hauled in 79 receptions on 110 targets for 841 yards and 4 touchdowns. This landed him 28th overall for wide receivers in fantasy last season, and with the low rank being from a lack of touchdowns. He did have to manage with not having his rookie quarterback late in the year, but will have him back to start this season. He will be contending for targets quite a bit though, with T. Higgins emerging as a star and with Jamar Chase, former LSU teammate of Burrow, being drafted in the first round. Boyd is a playmaker, but will he be able to produce in a crowded wide receiver core? As we talked about earlier, the Rams got a better scheme fit at quarterback with Matt Stafford this offseason, and Cooper Kupp will also look to capitalize this season. Last year, Kupp amassed 92 receptions for 974 yards and 3 touchdowns, racking up 208.7 fantasy points as the 19th wide receiver. Kupp had a drop-off season, going from 1,100 yards and 10 touchdowns in 2019, but will look to bounce back with a better quarterback at the helm. He is dynamic after the catch, as he ranked number 3 in yards after catch last season, and pair that with his amount of receptions, ranking in the top 10, Kupp isn't far from being a top 15 wide receiver. CeeDee Lamb was another breakout rookie and will look to build even more in his sophomore year. He finished the year with 74 catches for 935 yards and 6 touchdowns. With Prescott at the helm, he had 29 catches for 433 yards and 2 touchdowns, which was a great tandem in the first few weeks of the season. The Cowboys were the pass-heaviest team in the NFL last year, so you can only imagine what this year could hold for CeeDee Lamb. A familiar face in fantasy football in recent years will be sporting new team colors and a new logo on his helmet. Julio Jones was sent to the Titans this offseason and will look to build his legacy as a top wide receiver with Ryan Tannehill. Jones had a shaky year last year, struggling with injuries throughout and only playing in 9 games. What is still impressive about this is the fact that he's still ranked top 15 for points per game. He racked up 51 catches for 771 yards and 3 touchdowns, averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game. Last season, Julio had 6 straight 1,000-yard seasons and will look to get back on track this year. He will be sharing targets with A.J. Brown, and the Titans lean on Derrick Henry quite a bit, but with another weapon in the passing game, we could see more from the Titans' passing game through the air.
Brand new banger.
Another wide receiver that will be repping a new team this year as he looks to bounce back from injuries last year is Kenny Golladay. He is now a New York Giant, where he walks in as the number 1 wide receiver for the team. Last year, he only brought in 20 passes for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns in 5 games. But if you look back at his 2018 season, where he had his first 1,000-yard season, and he built on that in 2019 with an 1,100-yard year and 11 touchdowns. Coming into a struggling Giants offense that looks on the verge of becoming competitive, he could be the missing piece that they need. This bodes well for Golladay and for people who draft him this season, as he should see a healthy amount of targets and opportunities to score for you and your fantasy squad. Sticking on the trend of injury-crushed seasons, Michael Thomas looks to build back to his former self after injuries ruined his year last year and people's fantasy teams last season. Thomas played in 7 games, but for a few of those he came out early because of his injuries. He caught 40 passes for 400 yards, but 0 touchdowns. This season could be a bounce back, but the quarterback situation in New Orleans after Drew Brees' retirement is still up in the air. Making my most educated prediction, if Jameis Winston is the quarterback, Michael Thomas will have another top 15 season barring injuries. But if it's Taysom Hill, this becomes a completely different offense, and I don't know if Thomas will be overly involved. I still think you have to take Thomas in the draft, but definitely don't spend a high draft pick on him. Find at least one or two other options before you look at putting him in your lineup. This next wide receiver I had a very hard time ranking. He is a super talent, but the quarterback he has to work with is a problem for me. Devonta Parker finds his way inside the top 25, but I wanted him to be higher. The only reason he isn't is because of Tua Tagovailoa. Towards the end of the season, he and Tua started to kind of find a rhythm, but for most of Tua's time as quarterback last season, it seems like he ignored Parker altogether. Davante had a breakout year in 2019 with 72 receptions for 1,200 yards and 9 touchdowns. That number dipped all the way down to 63 receptions for 700 yards and 4 touchdowns in 2020. I firmly believe he can be a top 15 wide receiver, but I need to see Tua call his number on a more consistent basis for that to happen. Deebo Samuel is yet another wide receiver who couldn't get going in the 2020 season because of injury. He has a large amount of talent and hasn't had that breakout season yet, but when he is on the field, he shows a lot of promise. This season, if he stays healthy, it seems that it could be his time for that breakout year as a wide receiver. As other teams, he has uncertainty at quarterback as the 49ers traded up in the draft to get Trey Lance. Jimmy G had injury trouble last season, and it seems the 49ers may be trying to move away from him and move on with the move that they made in the draft. How does this affect Deebo? I don't know. Only time will tell on how this season plays out for him, but either way, I think Deebo has a breakout year, and he could be a fantasy player who becomes a crucial part of your team. Finishing off the top 25 for your wide receivers is a dynamic receiver who just can't seem to keep himself on the field consistently. Deontay Johnson had a great year last year as he hauled in 88 passes for 923 yards and 7 touchdowns, but he seemed to go down very easily during games, and I know that from experience. For a lot of the year, he seemed fragile and you couldn't rely on him being one of your top wide receiver slots. Either way, Johnson proved that when he is on the field, he is a valuable asset inside of the top 20 for total points with 209 and inside the top 25 for points per game at 14.7. He is a player that could easily be your wide receiver 2 and could find himself inside the top 20, if not higher. All right, everybody, that is it for this episode's analysis of your wide receivers for the 2021 season. Tune in next time for an episode where we break down the tight end position and see how you can maximize points in an area that was very weak last year. This has been the Lucky Shots Podcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Ricky Larson, and we'll see you next time.
Brand new banger.
Thank you for listening to the Lucky Shots Podcast. Join us next week.